Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. My name is John Goff. I'm the college's Chief Advancement Officer. I'm really excited to see you all here tonight. Not only do we have folks joining us in person tonight, I think we have almost 80 people joining us virtually tonight. This is a hybrid streamed event, so the college is really proud and excited to be offering both ways to enjoy this event tonight. Despite all the misery the pandemic heaped upon us, I think it's also given us a chance to think about how we do things and the chance to innovate. So that is very, very exciting. We are proud and honored to host the Behrend Lecture tonight. It's been almost 3 years since we've had an in-person Behrend Lecture. It's been a long time coming, so we're really glad to have you here tonight. Daniel Behrend has been talking to me about having Monica Zimmerman here since last summer, so we're so glad that it's finally happening. Each of you has a program. You can open it up and read about other exciting events coming up at the college in the coming weeks. We hope to see you all again soon. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Daniel Behrend to the stage to tell you a little bit more about Bernard Behrend, for whom this lecture is named.
Thank you for coming to tonight's event. As I said, I'm Daniel Behrend. I'm here with my spouse, Susan, and my brother David, and his wife. Thank you. Senior. I'd also like to thank Monica for helping me out with coordinating this event this evening, and John Goff. And Dad was a member here for 59 years. And we still have some of the records of when he became a member, when he signed in the ledger in the book. This is the 9th lecture. We started in April of 2014. And we've had a number of speakers, but a few that we've had always interested in one of Dad's interests. And one was the Civil War. That was the first lecture. And that was Civil War and nursing. And one of the other lectures was on medicine and music. And here today we're going to have a wonderful lecture on medicine and art. So I'll turn the program over to my sister Catherine in New York City, who's on the screen virtually, or she should be. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, and to the college for hosting this series. When we were thinking about the topic for the excuse the fire engines in the back, I'm in New York. When we were thinking of the topic for the 2022 lecture and living through our current state of affairs, it was really quite easy and obvious to me what the topic and who the speaker should be for 3 main reasons. My father practiced preventive medicine and highly respected the emerging field when he got into it. He would often recount about his early undergraduate biology paper at the University of Pennsylvania on sanitary conditions in Philadelphia restaurants. We still have the paper. My father was also proud of Philadelphia, being the home of both the Gross Clinic and the Agnew Clinic by the artist Thomas Eakins, who trained at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, PAFA. He would comment on how much he can learn from studying those paintings. He and my mother would have been also very proud of the city of Philadelphia's leaders in arts, music, and political worlds when they all rallied in 2006 and raised $68 million to keep the Gross Clinic in its city of birth. The second reason for our topic tonight is, of course, COVID. We have been inundated 24/7 on all our devices with visual images, I'm not sure we can call them art, of medicine, of death, of doctors, of nurses, of despair, and of grief. The third reason is I heard our speaker, Monica Zimmerman, I think it was 3.5 years ago, Monica, talk on innovations in art and medicine's 500 years of collaboration. I was so impressed with her vast knowledge, her incredible compassion toward healing, her clarity in presentation, and her good humor. For her full and extensive bio, I've asked Rachel to put her full bio into the chat. Monica is a transformational administrator. At least that's what her LinkedIn page says. And I think she is transformational, so I want to use that term. Monica has a vast portfolio of increasing responsibilities at PAFA, including all educational programming, visitor services, youth family pre-college activities, continuing education, all events relating to exhibits, and museum operations. That is a very, very busy arts professional. But the most relevant activity to the College of Physicians is on an ongoing teaching basis. She teaches hundreds of medical students about medicine and art as part of their formal training. It is with anticipation and great pleasure that I introduce you to Monica Zimmerman.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you specifically the college and the Behrend family for giving me this opportunity to do two of my favorite things. One, take off my mask and still feel safe. And two, talk about the ways that innovation, both in the scientific and medical field and the art field, has sort of made us the people that we are today, and to hopefully pique your interest in other ways that we might be able to continue this work. This is a passion of mine, so hopefully we're going to have a little fun tonight. I'm also going to give you one caveat at the beginning of this. When I get excited, I talk fast. So for those of you who I can see, if I am talking so fast, you can't actually follow the whirlwind tour I'm about to take us on. Somebody raise a hand. Jackie, promise me you'll raise a hand or something. Because what I want to do tonight is actually take a look at a handful of moments throughout history in which we as a community have sort of advanced our understanding of the human body through creative problem solving and questioning across disciplines, including some contemporary moments that I'm going to guess are less likely to be known to you than some of the historic objects I will show you. It's that simple. So to set us up, I just want you to think about how the world is built now, because on the one hand, you sort of have the boundary pushers and the questioners. You've got your artists and your creatives. And on the other hand, we set up the scientists and the doctors and the data consumers as responsible for sort of applying and codifying new facts and making them relevant to human health. At PAFA, as you well know now, we have a huge program for medical students that works on empathy, unconscious bias, observational skills through the arts. And one of the things that I'm going to try to seed this talk with tonight is how they receive a lot of the same information. Because I think it's really interesting to know how people who are about to become the field of medicine are thinking about the way art influences their thought process. But we're going to have to go back in time for me to give us some context and start. So I'm going to start back in history and move swiftly up to the present. And I'm going to do this for two reasons. One is because it's technically only pretty recently, like the last 100 years, that we actually separated art and medicine. Most previous scientists and physicians would have studied at art school or would have sort of unselfconsciously relied on artists as collaborators in information gathering in ways that I'm gonna go on record and say that our current healthcare system would probably never allow. But nonetheless, they helped us along, and so I think there's an interesting tension there. And second is my fundamental belief from all of this work that I've done over the last decade with the healthcare field, that there is an absolute need to re-articulate the value of questioning in ways that artists are profoundly good at, but which the medical field sometimes actually trains doctors not to do. So that's where we're starting from. So let's go way back, just for 1 second, because I want to remind us all that much of what we actually know about the evolution of modern medical understanding actually comes from the records that artists left us, right? It comes from drawings and illustrations particularly, a couple of sculptures here and there, but far more prolifically from the visual arts than from actual text. And that's, of course, because artworks are uniquely positioned to circulate knowledge quickly and broadly, and they don't require access to literacy or a shared language, right? Had everybody done what was popular, though, which was to copy those texts over and over and over again, we would never have gotten anywhere, right? Because y'all saw these, right? Not good. This is not quite how my body looks, let alone yours. So I want us to remember some of the Pathfinders, and the Pathfinders are not going to do things the way that you expect them to. So here, of course, are works by Leonardo da Vinci, who died 503 years ago this month. And for my history lovers, I'm choosing Da Vinci over a couple of other people to choose from because his work both precedes Michelangelo and Vesalius by decades and also is by far more accurate. And therefore, he gets to be the Pathfinder tonight. But also partly because I think that Leonardo da Vinci represents the best of the curious mind. And it is precisely because he is a humanist. It's because he's a painter, a sculptor, a draftsman, an inventor, an architect, and then, yes, also a scientist and an anatomist, that he doesn't allow specialization to cloud his problem-solving skills, if you will. And another little known fact about Da Vinci that I don't think gets talked about enough is that if you don't know this, Da Vinci is not born into a lot of means. He does not have the same access to education that a lot of his contemporaries would have. So he never learns Latin and Greek. He doesn't have the opportunity to study it. And I think most of us have been trained to consider lack of access to the best possible education, a hindrance to our evolution. But I want you to also think of how it might create new ways of thinking. So unable to read pretty much any of the major textbooks available in his day, Da Vinci has to approach science uncontaminated by contemporary knowledge. And I don't mean that to say that all contemporary knowledge is bad, but within whatever contemporary knowledge we have are baked into it the prejudices, the biases, the superstitions, and the errors of the past. So this is a different way to have to investigate the problem. In his lifetime, Da Vinci is guessed to have dissected approximately 30 bodies, largely by candlelight, sometimes with the permission of the church, sometimes not. Sometimes it went really well, sometimes he almost went to prison for being a sorcerer. It takes a little bit of the good and the bad to have a really big impact on the world. But what I want you to think about when you think about Da Vinci is how his methods of study, the methods of an artist, demonstrate the sort of out-of-the-box thinking that I'm talking about. So first and foremost, if you look at what's on the screen here as compared to what our original illustrations looked at, first and foremost, he acknowledges that the body has 3 dimensions. Key sort of observational skill about what we're all walking around in. Prior to this, we are recording the human body as a sort of static, 2-dimensional, topographical object. Which is, of course, absurd because it is a series of organs, each with a size, a shape, a weight, a color, and systems that have patterns and observable qualities. And I would like to argue that the body is, for all intents and purposes, a biomechanically programmed sculpture. And if you look at it that way, you learn different things than if you look at it just straight on as a flat series of colors and shapes and lines. So how might looking at the body in 3 dimensions, if one were an artist, change what you see, or how would you do it? So one of the things Da Vinci's gonna do, how about you make great use of strings and wires and actually make the body move, almost like a human marionette, so that you can get all of the poses that might be available in life that are not necessarily available in death. So if you look on the screen here, you'll see you've got sort of the shoulder muscles and tendons and everything in different positions based on what's happening with the arm. Well, he has to make the arm move. He's not holding the arm up while he draws. He is actually figuring out how to sort of sculpt it into different positions. How about looking at that candle over there that's providing the candlelight by which you work and going, you know what molten wax is really good at doing? Being injected into things, small things, like ventricles. And it might puff them back up to the shape that they were when the body had a life force running through it. And now I can see their shape and their volume and I can start to understand their function. How about illustrating the body in multiple views of various specimens, knowing and acknowledging through drawings that the heart looks different from the top than the side and the bottom, and using cross sections and cutouts rather than this topographical perspective, so that the unique visual and spatial realities of the body's interior spaces can also be fully studied, not just the exterior spaces. I should point out that while I'm celebrating Da Vinci, there is one major exception. We should all be sort of cognizant of our errors so we can improve here, right? And that is the fetus. Da Vinci is known for not getting the fetus in the mother's womb quite right, probably because he didn't have access in those 30 bodies to an actually currently pregnant, dead female body. So he's working with what he's got plus like some pregnant cow carcasses. So it's a weird situation. So this one he doesn't get right, but everything else is unsurpassed in medical illustration. If you fast forward about 100 years, we get the rise of institutions dedicated to standardizing this new understanding of the human body. And this is an innovation in and of itself, right? To not just repeat textual knowledge without community, but to come together in a community to share knowledge. This is an innovation. And here we've got the Amsterdam Surgeons Guild, which has been able to convince King Philip II that it's actually kind of necessary for surgeons to have a full and correct anatomical understanding of the human body before they perform surgery. So now they don't have to do it in the secrecy of candlelight in cathedral basements anymore. When you get to the point of the Amsterdam Surgeons Guild, these are king-sanctioned annual public demonstrations of what's happening in medicine. A lot has changed between Da Vinci's sort of furtive dissections and this moment. A lot of that has to do with time. Part of it has to do with this happening in Protestant Holland as opposed to Catholic Italy. It's worth noting the way that culture affects what we do allow ourselves to do in science. But it's become so interesting to the public and so popular that these demonstrations are not only required for perhaps people like yourselves that are part of a college of physicians and the students who would be studying in medical schools, but also the paying public. So I've actually read reports of some of these annual dissection and anatomical demonstrations, and what I've learned is that some of them were so popular and sold so many tickets that they also included maybe a little band on the left, maybe a little wine bar and refreshment situation on the right to keep you entertained. The only thing it seems that was universally prohibited in all of these, laughter. Which seems to me like a bit of an arbitrary rule once you allow the wine. I don't know about the rest of you. But this is in part an educational event and in part a social event for a certain class of people. But part of the point of this is that the Surgeons Guild is doing something new. They're codifying knowledge in community, and they need a way to share the prestige of this new learning environment. They need it also to build public trust in the qualifications of a growing field of physicians and surgeons trained by the academy. So scientist to scientist information sharing is not going to cut it for them. They need something that's going to be widely consumable and circulatable. They need something that is an enduring image that will sort of manage their brand. They need a painting, obviously. And so they commissioned this and other portraits of medical education advancing, and now we have these objects that have really hung on in the Western art canon and have sort of embedded themselves into popular culture. Even if you have no idea what you're looking at, almost everybody I've ever shown this painting to can recognize the composition as like, oh, I think I saw that one time. You might not know who Rembrandt is or the Amsterdam Surgeons Guild, but if you don't believe me, that this sort of arcane subject matter, it's just a guy tugging on the tendons of a forearm, right? But has really penetrated popular culture. Take a little tour with me of the ways in which this exact composition has been used by Mattel. Yeah, you have Sesame Street, we've got Mattel, we've got your Saturday morning cartoons. Batman is a superhero, but he's also a real man. He's got muscles. Arguably my favorite, because here you've got your Star Trek one, and I think it's just extra cheeky that the one android in the room is the one who has to get dissected, not any of the humans. This one might be the most telling in terms of broad impact, because this is no longer the West. This is a cosmetics ad from, if I understand it correctly, a billboard outside of Seoul, Korea. So not only can Rembrandt sort of sell you the value of burgeoning medical education, but he can also sell you mascara, it turns out. And for anybody who's particularly into this moment in history, please note that the wildest new development is that there is now a virtual reality version of the anatomy lesson of Dr. Nicholas Tulp, which is, of course, the composition that we were looking at by Rembrandt. And you can actually put on VR goggles and a headset and enter the amphitheater and participate in this particular surgery now, if you would like to. I don't think you can actually be Dr. Tulp. You have to be one of the secondary or tertiary level doctors. But you get to go in there and you get to actually engage with it and be part of it. So it's really hanging on. But the Amsterdam Surgeons Guild is just the beginning of a burgeoning movement in which we are standardizing medical practice. It's beginning to proliferate in the old world and the new world in the form of universities. We start establishing medical schools, right? And the more people you have trying to study medicine, the more the problem of no access to bodies becomes sort of a sticking point, right? You need new tools to teach more and bigger groups of people about what we know about the human body and health. So enter the écorché. Now the écorché is just a French word that translates loosely into flayed man. It's traditionally a figure that's usually sculpted, but sometimes drawn or painted without skin. And in the 18th and 19th century, the écorché sculpture becomes suddenly incredibly important because really, just think about this for a second. How long can you go on expecting people to show up for live dissections that take like multiple days? They're smelly, they're dirty. It's impractical, the logistics, the timing, the cost, all of it. Not to mention it's unethical because there are very few voluntarily available bodies for this type of study. I could go on a long rant about the nasty business of grave robbing, mortuary thieving, other unsavory economies that developed here and around Europe with the rise of medical schools. I won't. We'll consider that a teaser. There are books. Go read them. They're wildly interesting. But the écorché is an artistic solution to a medical education problem. It's three-dimensional. It solves the super annoying problem of bodies having skin on them, so you can't see anything underneath it. And because of new sculptural technologies in the 19th century, it could be copied incredibly quickly, made into a mold into which you pour plaster, you pour a metal of some kind, and eventually wax, which is super easy to manipulate, and you can punch out écorché after écorché, ship them around the world, and all of a sudden, you have eliminated the sort of basic and fundamental need for this unsavory digging up of the bodies for class problem. So the écorché is an artistic solution, honestly, to an educational issue. Another one happens here in Philadelphia very specifically, and these objects are still here. I hope you've seen them, and if not, go see them. We had this really great moment in Philadelphia where Caspar Wistar, in 1808, becomes the chair of anatomy at the department at the University of Pennsylvania. He has written the first and most important text on human anatomy to come out of North America, and he's got a big task. He's got an amphitheater of eager doctors sitting there. He's got to figure out how to teach them about parts of the body that even in écorché is in some ways too small to share with a large group of people. So he's got kind of a head scratcher, and he's like, well, let me reach out to my buddy William Rush. Rush is the first great American sculptor. And this might not surprise you when you think about it, but our first great sculptor did not sculpt in marble. We don't have a lot of marble here in Philadelphia, turns out. So he's working in wood. So he's paying the rent, crafting sort of the mastheads on ships, you know, that mermaid that sails you safely into harbor. That's his bread and butter. So his medium is wood. And that's much easier to manipulate in a lot of ways. And so he goes, I got a solution. And what they did together was that Rush created at Wistar's commissioning hand these anatomical sculptures of parts of the human body that medicine really needed to understand better, but that were too small to talk about in a classroom. So for instance, that eyeball, think about a beach ball that kids play with on the sand. It's about this big. It's huge. It also comes apart. So if you're talking about, you know, the pupil, you keep it together. If you need to talk about the retina, the top comes off. And so it fundamentally changed what they were actually able to talk about with students very quickly, because an artist could think through sort of the visual spatial reasoning of how to make this work. For those of you who are not anatomists, like myself, you figured out there's an eyeball there. I'm gonna guess you figured out the jawbone because of the sneaky teeth that give it away. If you can't figure it out, down here on the left is the sphenoid bone, which is a tiny part of the cranium. So again, something that you're not going to be able to educate people about just using, you know, a single skeleton. Artists also have always wrestled with whether or not to portray their subject in an idealized manner, so your Instagram filter version when you get the commission for the portrait, or warts and all, if you will, everything that you actually see. And I think this is somewhat underappreciated, but it's growing in the field of medicine. Because in the cases where artists chose to portray their sitters with ruthless accuracy, you actually can track the advent and evolution of a number of diseases over time. Now, I can't show you all of them, but trust me that this exists. So I'm going to give you 2 quick examples. Right now, you are looking at a painting called Bathsheba at her bath. This is also by Rembrandt. I encourage you, look very closely for a few seconds. Can you see the medical information that artists and doctors have been focused on for the last couple of decades? A little tip, for those of you wondering, the oncologists in the room are going to have a leg up on this one. While you're looking, I will point out that obviously Bathsheba did not sit for Rembrandt. Just making sure we have our history correct. Bathsheba, biblical character, Rembrandt, Renaissance painter. But like any other artist, he's going to use a real person to model in his studio for who this is. And in this case, Rembrandt's model is his longtime mistress. So it is a body he knows very well. So this is accurate to what this particular woman was experiencing in her day. So if you haven't seen it yet, I'm going to tell you what it is. Most researchers are fixated on the breast mass that is right here on her left breast, right up our screen. She's got a fairly significant piece of evidence here that she probably has metastatic breast cancer. It's probably advanced enough that it's spread into her lymph nodes. And now, while that could just be an interesting note about a really old painting for an art historian trying to, make their way in the world, it actually has pretty important ramifications for medical researchers too. So as an example, think for instance about the decades when breast cancer research and treatment are becoming widespread and become the focus of whole new parts of the medical world. One of the questions that you always end up having to start with in these moments where you're trying to attack a new disease is, how has that disease evolved over time? Did it used to exist? What did we call it? Who had it? How did it move in communities? Are there other records of it? Did it have a different name that I can find in another example somewhere? And try to create an actual history of some of these contemporary diseases that we're trying to treat. My point is that in many cases, when medicine starts looking for a timeline of a particular healthcare phenomena, if you're open-minded, you might consider looking to art history because portraits are also anatomical texts when done by the right artist. Here's another great example I accidentally just previewed for you. This is a portrait of Jacques-Louis David, the French politician, and it's done by American artist Rembrandt Peale. And even a layperson can usually look at this and after a couple of seconds pick up on the medical diagnosis that Rembrandt went ahead and included for us, which is that there's some fairly significant, what we would call asymmetrical slumping on the face of David here. Evidence of an underlying medical condition because he's got one half of his face is paralyzed. And your 2 best guesses there are going to be Bell's palsy or stroke. They both have significant implications for a leader. In this case, the historical record has told us that it was a stroke. He had it before Rembrandt painted him. But think about the implications, again, that diseases like this are captured by artists and put on canvas and circulated because in this time period, as a statesman, you could easily have hidden all of your healthcare needs and all of your medical conditions from the general public. So there's an implication here. We know that a stroke often has neurological implications. So now we have interesting questions. Both the people of the day have questions, but now we have questions about the decisions made after this moment and how this healthcare reality for this particular politician may have had other outcomes. And I will point out, because any of you are intrigued by this, going back in time or going to museums and diagnosing the portraits on the wall has become somewhat of a cottage industry for healthcare professionals. I know one Philadelphia physician who is not here tonight but who is particularly adept at finding syphilis in portraits of Europeans from this time period. So among other investigations. It gets published every time, for the record. I want to introduce you also to a somewhat lesser known Pathfinder. This is Sir Charles Bell. This is a drawing by Bell. This is not Bell the person. Bell is, amongst other things, a military surgeon who serves on the battle at Waterloo. It turns out he's maybe not the best surgeon of all time. One of his contemporaries from the battlefield at Waterloo noted that Bell's mortality rate for amputations was about 90%, which is horrifying if you think about it. But I want to give him a little credit here for a second, not that I'm here to defend him specifically, but I think part of it is because of what he was super interested in studying, which is the nervous system and the brain. Neurology, the sort of electrical impulses that were running through the body, because we didn't have a clear understanding of the nervous system 200 years ago. I mean, you can still read tales of people hooking themselves up to shock machines and shocking them because they're trying to figure out how electricity ran through the body. So he is particularly interested in the cases on the battlefield where there are brain injuries, nervous system injuries, very deep chronic pain-related injuries. So my point is he's taken on the hard cases. So maybe that 90% mortality rate, maybe it's just partly, anyway. I don't know why I'm trying to find a way to make space for this man. But what I want you to know about him is that the work that he does with these soldiers, chronicling everything he tries and learns from working on these patients, he becomes the first person to actually be able to articulate the difference between sensory nerves and motor nerves for the first time in medicine. And he is largely considered to be the founder of clinical neurology. And he documents these experiments not so much in text, but in images, because that's the only way they're going to spread widely. This new knowledge he's gaining, not in a hospital, but on the battlefield, right? So here you could actually see a documentation of trepanation. So essentially drilling a hole through the skull for some sort of brain surgery. And note, by the way, the tenderness of the portrait of the person, not just the medical procedure and the science behind it. But he is documenting in very, very precise detail for us every step of the procedure so that, should it be successful, another physician is going to be able to replicate it. And he's doing it not through words, but through pictures. This is another work by Bell, a painting this time. This is a soldier dying of tetanus. So many of us know to get our tetanus shots, but we don't know what tetanus is anymore, right? Welcome. This is the end stages of tetanus when the muscle spasms and the constrictions of the body are so intense that they involuntarily arch the back. This will later progress. Some tetanus will actually shatter the bones of the back. It gets that bad. And death from tetanus comes when the muscle spasms reach the diaphragm and you suffocate. It is an unpleasant way to die, and he saw a lot of it on the battlefield. And even though when he paints this in 1809, we are still 8 decades away from even naming tetanus, I think, let alone having a vaccine, I think this image is a testament to visualizing where we would be if progress didn't take place. I'm going to put this another way for you. The next time that you get that call from your primary care physician telling you to go get your tetanus booster, tell me this picture isn't going to float up into your brain, right? Push that another step further. The next time you want to convince someone about the importance of a public health initiative, and they're just not into your argument, consider that some people are always going to need something more like this. They're going to need something else to compel them, even if you don't. Because it's not always going to be about you. Sometimes consider the other alternatives to messaging. This is a very powerful argument for a tetanus booster. It's so easy, right? And so I'm pointing this out particularly because I think some of this out-of-the-box thinking is more important now than ever as we continue to see a greater and greater resistance to science itself and science facts. We may need to convey the importance of those facts in another vocabulary. As one tiny example of the fact that I am not the only one thinking about this, note that back in 2020, when we were trying to figure out how we were going to get vaccines out in communities that were particularly resistant, the CDC partnered with the Georgia Department of Public Health and like 6 or 7, I think, arts organizations in Atlanta, Georgia, to create community-based signage by artists in those communities who already have community trust, to sort of synthesize down into non-scientific ways the argument for new public health protocols. They leveraged the art community in the neighborhoods in which they live to try to create new compelling messaging. And I don't know if you can read all of these. I think my favorite one is the one in the top left that says, loving myself may mean loving you at a distance. It's a compelling new framework for something that I think a lot of us are like, but I read the report, obviously I'm going to get a vaccine. Here's another way of thinking about conveying that type of policy. Now, in Philadelphia, I want to make an argument too that artists have also sometimes been better at thinking about new technologies as opportunities. And in this case, I want us to think about the camera. So artists are actually responsible for helping us advance what we don't know about the body into totally new territory at the end of the 19th century, and they do it this way. And I just find it fascinating to contemplate that it is often artists who take up new tools first, new technologies, before the scientists. And I would like to posit that I think that's because a lot of artists' brains will look at something and say, I wonder what the outcome might be. And a lot of physician brains and science brains are going to pick up a tool and go, I know how to use this. It's a different planned outcome for what's about to happen. Now, a historic example that you are looking at right now in Philadelphia is motion study photography, which for the first time in human history allowed humans from all disciplines, not just artists, but doctors and scientists and all sorts of people, to see the subtleties of the body in motion that are undetectable to the human eye. You may have heard of Edward Muybridge. If you haven't, you've definitely heard the origin story of how this project got happened. He's the guy who gets hired to help a billionaire figure out if all 4 hooves of the horse are ever off the ground at one time. That's Muybridge. That's how he gets this gig at UPenn to study people, because he's done it with animals so much. And it's done actually by setting up a series of cameras on a tripwire, and then pull that tripwire, and they fire off in very close but not identical succession. And then what you actually get is a snapshot of all of these moments within a moment that your eye can't see. And you can expose them either this way in sequence, or you can expose them this way on one plate with all of the images of that one motion in one place. Guys, this blew people away. This was just like fundamentally face melting for a lot of people, because remember, there's no TV, there's no internet, there's no moving images of any kind. So he does this in Philadelphia particularly, and they are organizing people into thousands of experimental poses, because they want to understand every single thing that happens. So you're seated, you're running, you are pole vaulting, you're carrying water, you're spanking your kid, you're doing everything that you can possibly imagine. And they define, for the very first time on these images, the biomechanical processes of the human body that no one had ever seen. And I want you to just sit with that for a moment, because I'm going to guess that many of you are well established in your field, you're very smart, you're very well educated, you know your work. Imagine thinking you understood everything about the body because you are an expert physician, an expert anatomist, an expert nurse, but you've never actually been able to study its musculature and skeleton in motion because your eyes can't do it. You're physically incapable of doing it. And you can't, ask someone in the middle of a pole vault to just pause for a second. I want to see what your muscles are doing. You can't do it. So this is a revelation that gives us so much more information than we could ever get by ourselves. But as far as I know, no doctor came up with this idea. Artists did it. And I would argue that today, artists are doing just as much as scientists to investigate the possibilities and the prejudices of new technologies as we develop them, and making us think a little bit more about our collective future. So one artist I think you might have, I'm going to guess you've never heard of, but that this particular crowd might find really interesting, is Heather Dewey Hagborg. So Heather has done a pile of creative things. Please look her up after this. You will be blown away. But I'm just going to tell you about one, and it's called Stranger Visions. And what she did was she wandered around the streets, the waiting rooms, the bathrooms of New York City, and she picked up hairs that she found on the street, discarded pieces of chewing gum, cigarette butts that people had thrown away. And then she took them back, and using some of our most cutting-edge technology, she extracted the DNA from those little bits of lives lived, analyzed it, and then had it computationally generated out into 3D printed life-size sculptures of these people, representing what those individuals might look like based on genomic research. So that's what you're looking at. This is just one installation of hers. That's the cigarette butt, that's where it came from, that's the information that the computer spits out, and that is the image that the computer says this particular DNA information is most likely to generate. So the artist is also, I think, asking the public to question some really specific things that we continue to take for granted, even as science sort of moves rapidly forward and we're all really excited. We know so much more about how to treat things because we've spliced DNA, right? Okay, for instance, I think one of the questions that Heather Dewey Hadborg has for us is, when exactly are we going to begin to generate even a little consternation that we are now constantly shedding this incredibly potent and personal information everywhere we go? Hair is brushed off your cardigan, a cigarette butt dropped, a coffee cup left behind in a diner. Information that doesn't seem significant to us, but that technological advancement can now actually read and use without your consent on a pretty regular basis. If you don't believe me that that's possible, it is happening already. So these are artists who are really going, it is good technology, but also like, hold on, let's talk about the limits. Let's talk about both the possibilities and the limits. And I think considering the fact that when she does this work, the computer actually spits out multiple possible images of what the person could look like. And she has to pick which one she wants to put in the exhibition. Puts a fairly fine point also on the fact that our desire for genetic determinism, for our DNA to actually be able to predict the whole person, is not at all accurate, right? She still has to make choices. And I say this to you because you have all seen the power of this type of research shown to you as an ultimate good. If you have ever watched a forensic TV show, you have watched the crime be solved because somebody extracted DNA from a tiny shard of bone, threw it into a computer, sculpted out a head, and whoop, they found the murderer every time. But there is a huge amount of subjectivity in this work. And so you have artists like Heather Dewey Hadborg who want to draw attention to that subjectivity and make us wrestle with it just a little bit more, right? Told you I was going to jump around. Now I'm going to go back because I want to talk about a couple of moments in history, and this was one of the other ones, and I think it's important. This is obviously World War I. I think you can probably tell from the image. And I almost took it out because I am tired of thinking about war. I don't know about you. But at the same time, I think it's probably therefore more important than ever that we take a pause on this moment, because World War I is a great example of one of our worst contradictions as humans, which is that we have always managed to find ways to kill each other faster than we have found ways to heal ourselves. And World War I is one of those really big moments because technology advanced so quickly that the nature of war changed faster than the nature of medicine could change. 4 years wasn't enough time. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on what is World War I. There's Google for that. But what I want to make sure that you do know is what those technologies are. So in World War I, trench warfare, so that the actual activity of war hasn't changed at all. You still dig a hole and then hide in it until somebody yells charge. On the other side, the technology of war is now machine guns, nerve gas, and other sort of nervous system related gases and things that we put out into the world. So these are struggles, right? And one of the things I think a lot of people know is that doctors and nurses got drafted into the military all the time in moments of war. You would have served in the medical tents. That's clear, that makes sense to us. What do you think they do with artists when they get drafted into the war? So it turns out that artists also have unique skill sets. And in World War I, American artists drafted into the military tended to end up in one of two camps. The first one is the camouflage unit. I say it, it makes sense, right? I don't have time for that talk, but it's fascinating what they could do to hide a submarine. Okay, but the other place they get drafted are the medical tents. So here's the thing. Imagine the triage situation on an active battlefield, okay? Because of the nature of battle timing, hundreds of thousands of patients are going to arrive at the medical tent at the same time when the battle is over and it's safe enough to go in and get them on stretchers. Hundreds, if not thousands, are going to arrive at the medical tent at one time to meet a finite number of healthcare professionals. It doesn't matter how many patients there are, you can't scale up the field tent. There are far too many wounded, and in ways that we don't know how to treat, for doctors to wait and see if new ideas that they have to try to treat new wounds they've never seen before are making an impact. You see a wacky wound, you treat it, you move on, you hope it worked, there are hundreds waiting. So what you're looking at right now are the sketches of an artist named Ivan Albright, who served in Europe in a medical tent in France, where artists were incredibly valuable because they could be deployed to use their sketchbooks to document the changing nature of these wounds, particularly the healing process. They could literally go on rounds behind the medical professionals to use the basic properties of composition, shape, line, color, pattern, all of that, to convey the healing process back to the physicians at the end of the day as a series of sketches. If you can't conceptualize how that happens, let me put it to you this way. If you get a cut on your arm, you know that it's either healing well or infected, partly by how it feels, mostly by how it looks, right? It's going to change. So there is a distinct visual vocabulary around healing and infection that artists were uniquely positioned to capture, right? So this was a wildly novel but impactful solution to studying new treatments. They used artists. Another breakthrough in World War I that I find people don't know about, but that I think is fascinating, is that we got the first breakthroughs in the sort of idea of plastic surgery. It starts as a prosthesis, but it will become a concept around healing the whole body. Because if you think about what's happening with trench warfare, we suddenly have more facial wounds on soldiers than we've ever had in conflicts before, right? Because again, all those heads come up and they meet a machine gun. So they estimate over 20,000 soldiers lost all or part of their faces on the American side in the year that we were in World War I? That's a lot of specialized wounds that we don't yet have a way to treat. So, what do? Well, enter American sculptress Anna Coleman Ladd. That's who you are looking at here, born in Bryn Mawr. She's reading about the unfolding tragedy on the front lines at home, and she thinks, well, I have an idea as a sculptor, like I know how to make things look the way I want them to look. So toward the end of 1917, she goes over to France, hooks up with the Red Cross, and opens the Studio for Portrait Masks in Paris. And you can imagine from these images what she's gonna do. She's gonna give these men their faces back. So the way that it works is that the men, after their wounds had actually closed up and were fully healed, they would go to her studio, and over the course of a month, she would take first a cast of their face. So if you remember being in elementary school and having like paper mache put on your face to make a little mask, just like that, which she would then use to make a very, very thin copper-plated mask that would actually be the final product. And she's going to craft them to be perfectly matched to these folks as much as she can. They're going to weigh between 4 and 9 ounces. Depending on whether it's a full or a partial mask of the face. And you can see in these, they're mostly held on by like the arms of spectacles to go over your ears, put the weight somewhere. And she uses this very specific hard enamel paint that was both washable, kind of important, right? It's only gonna get one mask, not like now where you have one for every day of the week in every outfit, one mask in this scenario. And it had this sort of dull, flesh-like finish on it because she would paint them while they were on the patients themselves so that she could match two things, not just skin tone, right? Because all of us have different coloring. You don't want it to look like Phantom of the Opera here. That's not the goal. The goal is to bring back the whole person. But the other thing is she's trying to match their sort of resting facial expression. Because you're only going to get one in this scenario, right? And we all, it turns out, have like a resting facial expression. Some of us are smiling, some of us are a little sour. And so she had to get that right, because the personality is part of what we're talking about here. We've moved into the space where we understand that the body needs to be whole. The person has to be whole for the body to be whole. Sorry, that's what I'm trying to get out there. It's a new way of thinking about pushing healing into another area, right? Because having an open wound on your face, and these are 4 before and afters, because everybody loves a before and after. Not having an open wound on your face is only one part of healing and re-entry, right? If you can't get a job, if you can't kiss your wife, if you scare your children, if you just don't feel like yourself, how well did the medicine work, right? This is the final sort of pill that makes the medicine work. And it's the predecessor for some of our modern ideas of healing the whole person. So fast forward 100 years, and I'm going to give you a contemporary counterpoint to this. Because now, not only do we have plastic surgery, but we've moved that technology along so far that we have reconstructive surgery, and we have elective cosmetic surgery, right? What do we do with what we've done with this technology? Artists are going to ask us to ask ourselves some questions. And so here you get Orlan. I'd like you to meet Orlan. Guess what name? O-R-L-E-N, like Prince or Madonna. What name? She is a French artist that makes a splash in the art world in the 1990s with a project she called The Reincarnation of Saint Orlan. And what she's going to do is she's basically using modern plastic surgery techniques to transform herself into someone who has one element from each of what the Western art world has codified as the most beautiful women of all time. So she is literally using her own body as the sculptural material, and she's now employing the surgeon and the tools of the surgeon as the art tools in this particular medium. It's obviously a little bit of a ludicrous experiment. It's a commentary on who gets to define beauty, of course. But I think it's really interesting that as part of her manifesto, she actually films and broadcasts live these surgeries into institutions, living rooms around the world. So you can watch Orlan's plastic surgery happening. I will point out, this is before TLC showed you all of the surgeries. Right? Like this was actually a revelation to people when it was happening. And now the surgeon's knife, right, is actually part of art making in an interesting scenario where this surgeon's hands might have been doing something very healing the day before. Now it's investigating a sort of an art relationship. And you can see here too that as part of these performances, she has the full ideal set of body parts laid out on her as she goes. You can see each of the images from the Western canon that she's taking something from. But she also would organize costumes for the surgeons and the support staff. She would sometimes have a musical score in the background. I mean, it's a whole environment that you're supposed to consume. And when she was finished, she would have the chin of Botticelli's Venus, the nose of Jerome's Psyche, the lips of Boucher's Europa, the eyes of Diana, and for reasons I cannot defend, the forehead of the Mona Lisa. I don't know why that's the part of the Mona Lisa. She's also gone on to do many other projects, all worth a look up, but her work is going to always ask us to consider how a healing technology both does and does not contribute to useful ideas about beauty that have implications for how we view our bodies and therefore the way that we take care of them and the way that we are not healthy. She's always going to be interested in how transient those ideas about beauty and health are. How sometimes ideas about beauty are unrelated to health in any way whatsoever that is useful at all. And the absurdities, of course, of mistaking what people look like as related to how valuable, healthy, or frankly, real, natural they actually are. So with that idea in mind, one more example from World War I, and then I want to close with some contemporary works that I think you're very likely have never encountered. So my last thing from World War I is I want you to know about the artist Clyde Wilson, because Clyde Wilson is actually one of the few artists who actually served on the front lines of the war. I think there were only 6 American artists who actually served on the front lines. And he's a lieutenant, and he's going to come back and capture his experience on the battlefield in his career. And he's pretty prolific. A lot of his works are in the Smithsonian if you want to see them in person. And much of what he creates is particularly interested not in telling you how war happens. We have photography by now. You can take a picture of the battlefield. He's interested in conveying the psychological effects of being in war. And so even works like this one that you're looking at that seem pretty abstract, I think, they're actually about the sensory experience that he has on that battlefield. And I'm realizing now that you won't be able to see this, so I'm going to read you what the title is. And I think I can get it. He titles this Flower of Death, the bursting of a heavy shell, not as it looks, but as it feels and as it smells. I believe. He's trying to convey that there is another layer of experience that he and other soldiers are having. But sometimes it was also a direct solicitation for more empathy, as here, where again, I think lay people, you can figure out what the signs and symptoms of medical treatment needed here are. On the one hand, our soldier doesn't have a left arm anymore, but that's not the thing I'm interested in. What I'm interested in here is what in those days we would have called the 1,000-yard stare, also known as shell shock. What we now know perfectly well is actually PTSD, a very diagnosable and treatable condition, right? But even at this moment in time, this is 100 years ago. It's not that long ago. We did not have appropriate language for this. We had, however, been documenting PTSD for millennia. So believe it or not, if you don't realize this, PTSD has been described for over 2,500 years in various texts. PTSD shows up in the Iliad and the Odyssey, it shows up in the Epic of Gilgamesh, it shows up in the Ramayana. Across cultures, we have noted this thing, but we've never quite allowed it to be something that was okay to have and to treat. It was just something we described and were sad about. By the time Wilson is painting, this PTSD has most recently been named around the time of the Civil War, nostalgia. Which is like, come on, it's gotta be the most insulting euphemism for PTSD that we managed to come up with over the years. But the point is that most doctors, and certainly the War Office of the federal government, viewed this illness as a sign of weakness, as one that only affected men of quote-unquote feeble will. Okay. And the recommended treatment, you don't know what the recommended treatment was for PTSD around World War I? It's a delightful choose-your-own adventure of either public shaming by your peers or electroshock therapy. Like literally you needed to go out and be told to like man up. That was a medical treatment for PTSD. Didn't work, for the record. But it would take 2 world wars and a lot of advocacy from regular people, like those people sitting in this room right now, to see enough images like this to start advocating for real change and real need for treatment. Because when you look at this, you can see it's not just my brother, it's not just my father, it's not just my son or my postman or the person who brings me my milk. This is the name, right? So it becomes not singular, it becomes a shared community need. And with artist actors like Wilson sharing what Soldier like more people got on board, and he was doing it in a translatable, non-scientific language, right? He's doing it with a tetanus painting. He's showing people something that they needed to create language about that they didn't yet have. And it would help to usher in a whole movement towards the next step of advancing healthcare, which was into the mental health space. And I'm putting this up on the screen because I just want to point out to you that this work is influential and it is ongoing and it is getting bigger and better every day. Melissa Walker, if you don't know who that is, she's an art therapist and a researcher at the National Intrepid Center for Excellence, has a great TED Talk on how and why art is becoming not just a possible tool for the treatment of veterans, but an essential tool for the treatment of PTSD and trauma in a number of scenarios. And not just because it's nice to be quiet and sometimes paint. It is, to be clear. But for scientifically studyable neurological reasons. For instance, making art allows patients with PTSD to access pre-language areas of the brain where the trauma sits in ways that talk therapy cannot do. Making art has been proven over and over and over again to specifically and significantly reduce the level of cortisol in the blood within 5 minutes of the activity beginning. These are measurable outcomes, and so they are codified into treatment plans now, and there's now an entire arm of the NEA called the Military Healing Arts Network that is heading up all of this clinical research and trying to put it into practice in really meaningful, community-based, broad ways that are accessible to everybody. Okay, so now, I'm going to ask for 5 more minutes. Can I have 5 more minutes? Can you stay with me? Okay. Because I want to leave you with just a few more artists from the present moment and note some of the radical conversations that they elicit in our classes with medical students, in the hopes that the conversations we're having will be inspiring to you today. So, meet Eleanor Manson. In 1972, Eleanor Manson was inspired to take on the Greek tradition of sculpting, which is when you take a block of marble, right, and carve away at it until you reveal the beautiful image within. But it's 1972, she's a feminist, bodies are a thing, and it should come as no surprise that women and people whose bodies have been highly policed are often very interested in exploring ideas about body. And so Eleanor Manson crashed diets for 45 days based on a very popular and widely circulated dieting plan from that particular time. So think the Atkins diet, South Beach diet, paleo, whatever is, wait for it, probably being pitched in the magazines in your doctor's waiting room right now. Right now. She picked up one of those, she took it literally, she did it. Over the course of the project, she photographs her body wasting away every single day in these very vulnerable images. The classical images actually established by Da Vinci, right? So also in the round, front, back, both sides. And she's documenting the process of literally carving her body through dieting. And I would point out that what maybe this is ridiculous, but this is a process that is relentlessly suggested to everyone in this culture, specifically women. Number of times that you might be told to diet, like, you can lose a few pounds. Your doctor will say that to you. And usually the path to that is, okay, so what type of diet will I now be embarking on to reduce, the size of my body? So she's documenting this in the round as if she is a figurative sculptor, right? As her body is sort of slowly carved by dieting into not just a classical ideal, but a more culturally ideal body, even in the now. And from the first to the last image over this project, 4.5 kilograms are slowly pared away, with each image showing just a very, almost indiscernible difference, because one day at a time, but from the beginning to the end, very dramatic, right? Now, fast forward 30 years, and you get the artist Castles. Castles is a transgender artist from Canada who now lives and works in the United States. And Castles takes Anton's early feminist work as inspiration for their own new piece that they call, instead of the traditional sculpture, this is cuts a traditional carving. So in contrast to what Anton is doing in 1972, which is arguably a more quote-unquote feminine act of dieting. Okay, for those of you who are on Zoom, please note the giant air quotes that I am making right now, because feminine act of dieting is something that I don't want to be held accountable for. But so I think there's a cultural push to sort of say that what Anton is doing is a feminine act of focusing on weight loss. And here, Castle's project is focusing on transforming the body into a traditionally, big air quotes, masculine ideal, read very muscular. And instead of dieting, Castle's is going to do this using contemporary bodybuilding techniques and their very advanced understanding of nutrition to gain 23 pounds of muscle in 23 weeks. Anybody here works out? Yeah, that's astonishing. And they're going to use a very similar documenting process. So in both cases here, the artist is using fairly popular and accepted ideas of healthy practices that pervade our culture, diet and exercise, as a tool. But what I think part of they're pushing at here is that those tools, as shown in the photographs, are actually serious stressors on the human body, right? Whether you are forcing the body to experience any kind of extreme state, whether it's bodybuilding, whether it's taking steroids, whether it's taking testosterone, which Castle took testosterone, whether it's literally starving the body, which is what a diet is. These are not natural states the body wants to be in, and yet both bodies are, sort of culturally speaking, a little bit more ideal at the end of the stress than they were before, even though that stressor doesn't really conform with any provable ideas about healthy activity, right? I also do want to point out, just while you're looking at this for 1 second, as a transgender artist, Castles is also very interested in pushing us to think about one other thing here, which is not just the body as material and what we want to think about in that way, but also asking us to really question our ideas about the gendered body, right? Castles eschew surgery throughout their entire life, and they sculpt their body. Different performances require them to do different things to their body in a way that their nutrition and exercise actually sort of moves their body across and between gender binaries at any particular moment, depending on what project they're doing. So moving between both biological and cultural context through diet and exercise. So, when I ask medical students, what questions about the body and health and society do these works make you think about? What do you imagine that they might say? Listen about that for a second. If you happen to think that it's probably kind of simplistic, that there's not always a correlation between health and beauty, let's say, you would be wrong. They take this real seriously. So they are compelled to ask a couple of the things that always come up. What will my responsibility be as a physician to counter cultural narratives about health, and how far am I going to go? Right? What magazines could I even have in my waiting room when I start my practice that would be helpful and not problematic? Is our social ideal of a masculine presenting body even real? Because Castle's biologically born female body, in a lot of ways, each achieves a more masculine ideal in these projects of being more sort of cut than any male assigned at birth is likely to be able to achieve in their lifetime. Sorry guys, but that's ridiculous. If healthcare is based on treating uniquely male and female bodies differently, from a medical perspective, how do I treat a trans body? How do I even know how to do that? How do I provide good healthcare to a trans body if zero medical research has ever been done on this particular subject, because medical research has been done on gender binaries? I mean, these students are asking huge questions, but they're asking them because they're looking at art, which I think is so interesting. Here's another favorite of mine, and this is the last pairing I'm going to show you, and then we can have a conversation. This is victimless leather. grown by Oren Katz and Yonat Zur of the Tissue Culture and Art Project, which is based out of Australia. They were attempting to grow a semi-living but inanimate object. I love that phrase. A semi-living but inanimate object, in this case a form of leather that was real leather but required nothing to die for it to exist. So this teeny tiny jacket is grown using a combination of mouse and human cells, and it's quite tiny. And when I say tiny, I mean like about 2 inches high and like 1.5 inches wide. So it's like a biker jacket for a mouse, or maybe a rat. They collaborated with Behrend, which is a company that, when not doing this, specializes in tissue-engineered cartilage for clinical applications. That's what they actually do for business. And I learned about this project when it was at an exhibition at MoMA about 10 years ago. And I was immensely fascinated by the fact, I continue to be fascinated by this, that almost everyone I showed this to winces a little. Or like makes squeaky face, that's what I call it, which is sort of like, ugh. And if asked if they would wear this, if it was in their size, most people are saying no before I have finished the question. Emphatically, no. I can't imagine this on their bodies. But they're also almost always saying emphatically no to me while wearing leather loafers and a leather belt, or sitting in a leather interior of a car, or sitting on a leather couch in their house, right? They are answering my question while unselfconsciously prioritizing a way of self-adorning and decorating their homes that literally prefers that material to require death to be a part of it, okay? Our students are usually really eager to talk about this. This should come as no surprise to you. But it's bigger and deeper than you might think it is. They are galvanized to contemplate questions like, why are we comfortable dealing with materials that require something to die, like leather, shoes, and hamburgers, more comfortable with that than something that didn't come with death? Like, what squeaks us out about the idea of circumventing death? That should be celebratory. We are in the healing field. They often have a little bit of cognitive dissonance about their response to this. They often ask, why do we think as a culture that something is more natural because we have the power to kill it before we use it? Why haven't we ever considered defining natural as like life honoring? That seems more natural to things and people that are alive in the community. A really big one that might not have popped into your mind yet. They will often also debate, this is really cool, but is it worth the resource cost? You know, laboratories and scientific research are not cheap. The carbon footprint of this work is not cheap. The education that went into these scientists, not cheap, right? It's actually an expensive project. So what they're often asking is sort of, is it more efficient to let some living things die than to create a version of them in a lab, right? Is efficiency the end goal? And if not, what is our end goal when we're going to make choices about life and death for people or for things that aren't us? These are big questions, right? These are great questions. Very last pairing that you get, well, no, this is the last artist in this pairing, is the artist Stellar. The same company, Behrend, that I just told you about, that does tissue-engineered cartilage, also worked with Stellar here, and they have grown him a third ear. You're looking at it on the screen. He's an Australian artist, and in this case, the way that this works is first they make a cast of his actual ear, so the shape is identical. From that cast, they made a biodegradable polymer scaffold that they then seed with living cells, his own DNA. The ear is then cultured in a rotating microgravity bioreactor, so it's like got its own little boom. It's going to grow in 3D because it's moving all of the time. It's going to be in a sterile environment. It's fed with the proper nutrients all the time, and it grows from cells into an ear. And the scaffold degrades, because that's what it's meant to do. And all you are left with is the cartilage of this man's ear for a third time. He will compellingly talk. Oh dear, should I take that off? I just watched at least one person go all the way back from that. Okay, very briefly, that's what it looked like before I got invented. And then we look at. interaction with people when they see that third ear. Most people initially react to it as if it's a soft prosthesis, so something added to the body that looks like the part it replaces but isn't. So, think of a metal or a wooden prosthetic limb. But technically, it was grown, right? It wasn't made, it was grown. It's his literal cells, his literal DNA. It's no different in its genetic makeup from any of the other appendages on his body, just started out differently. It also did that growing independently of cell arc. And then it was merged with cell arc, not with its ability to consent, by the way, although it was growing independently. And it was technically alive because it's growing. You have to be alive in order to grow. This artist sparks wild debate with the medical students. And I'm closing out with this because I hope that one of the things that we'll do is also seed questions in your own brain that you can wrestle with when you leave here tonight. So they ask delightful, debating questions, such as, all right, so if living tissue can be sustained, grown, and able to function fully outside the body, when does it become alive in that growth process? What is required for it to be defined as alive? Is the ear a part of cell arc? Is it a separate life? Have they mutually, now that they're merged, become a new life? Or are they two lives that are now intertwined? What's happening here? What do we want to do with this? What about organ transplants? There's real medical application to this sort of philosophical questioning, right? If an organ was grown by one person and is made of their DNA and then gets transplanted into another person, whose organ is it? Whose kidney? Original grower of kidney, recipient of kidney. So is it the original DNA that determines life and ownership, or is it the one that is currently feeding the system? Am I still me if I have your kidney, or am I me plus you? I mean, these are existential questions that we don't talk a lot about, but we super duper do celebrate transplant surgeries, right? But they're existential. Or how about what makes the body whole? Is it whole when you have 2 years? How do you know that? Are you whole when you have 3 years? Can you be more than whole? If you said 2 years, because that's what's sort of normal, then what are you implying about people who lose an appendage or people who are born with extra cartilage in places? Thinking about how biased we are about what's normal and what all of this represents is a big existential question. And probably the most debated of all time is the shortest question. Is it a real ear? And I actually want you to sit there and think for 8 seconds to yourselves, at home or in this room, what your answer to that question is and why. Is it a real ear? Why or why not? Because if you say it's not a real ear, I will tell you that there is always half of my medical school class that starts out with, it's not a real ear. If you say it's not a real ear because it can't hear, you will be in very good company. But then you have got to do a bunch of soul searching about what you just said about the entire deaf community that has ears and cannot hear. Right? And Sculptor knows this. He knows this is what's going to happen when this is presented. He wants you to have to wrestle with this. And so a few years later, Sculptor has the ear implanted with a tiny microphone. Yes, he did. Yes, he did. And that microphone can hear. That microphone can hear everything that Stellar can hear, and it can transmit what it hears. But doesn't transmit it to his brain because it's still in his arm, it's not connected to his brain, it's connected to the internet. So his ear is not just able to hear now, it hears for the whole damn world. So, now that you know that, now that that has happened, is the ear real now? Is it less real because now it's affiliated with technology? What are you going to do with that? I leave you to decide. I don't have any answer for you. I only ask you to wrestle with it on your own. Because I'm going to close out now, and what I want to say is that I know that these last couple of examples that I showed you are a very different type of collaboration and innovation than those in the 15th through the 19th centuries, right? But I would argue that they are no less important and impactful because they're responding to the needs that we have now, right? So first, we really needed medicine and art to work together just to help us fundamentally envision the human body accurately and understand how it worked. So we could learn about it better, so we could treat it better. Now, we need artists to help us interrogate the very fast-moving developments in science and medicine, and in some ways, how they affect our philosophies about what it means to be human, to be alive, and to be in a system together. Because I like to believe that it is a lot safer for us to contemplate the ethical ramifications of progress in science and medicine outside of the clinical setting, like maybe in an art museum gallery and not while experimenting on actual patients to see how that goes. So my final point for you is basically this. This is my thesis. Which comes no surprise. Art is not just a luxury, okay? It's a space where huge questions can and are being investigated without putting lives at risk. And so the next time that you decide to skip that afternoon visit to the art museum, don't. Because think of all of the important questions that you will be denying yourself a chance to get asked. We're very patient and kind crowd because I asked for 5 minutes and took 20. I am aware that that just happened. Thank you for sitting with me and making me feel that was it. They're allowed to ask questions, correct? I'll do my best if you have a question to answer. There are some processes up here that even I do not fully understand. Oh, that's good. I can see myself now. But I am happy if something in there sparked a particular interest or you want to go down a rabbit hole with me to have a conversation. I think here's the microphone. Yeah.
I was surprised he did discuss any of Euclid's work, like the Gross Clinic or the Agnew.
I didn't discuss it because I'm tired of it. Because I talk about it all the time. That's honestly the answer in a lot of ways. To be honest, the Muybridge Motion Study Photography Project is also a collaboration with Eakins, so he is sort of lightly present tonight. And I also have a contentious relationship with Eakins, and right now I'm not at him, so I just chose not to celebrate him. But a fair point, there are 2 very important things about medical education and the advancement of science and medicine here in Philadelphia. They're both currently on view at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. I think you have to do it so that the people on the Zoom can hear what you ask and then answer.
So I don't know much about you, so I'm just curious how you ended up in this world of both art and medicine. What led you to it?
That's a great question. I don't have a perfect answer for you except to say that I think that I am the product of our cultural system that pushes girls into the arts and boys into the sciences, and I realized as an adult that I find this just as interesting. And so I am bending my own career to be something that I am interested in by collapsing these 2 worlds. In reality, I had a couple of chance encounters about 10 years ago with some physicians who already understood and bought into the power of art, and they were looking for collaborators. So it was at the right place at the right time to meet people from the medical world that were willing to teach me enough for me to do my own research, create my own programs, and grow this big project at PAPA. So folks like Sal Mangione over at Jefferson, so that's how.
I'm kind of the counterpart of you. I'm a physician, a radiologist. I read X-rays, very visual, and I've recently become a medical artist making art from X-rays. So I'm
Oh, that's fascinating.
And I think it's really neat to blend the 2.
Oh, well, thank you, and that's lovely. And I love So something about radiology that you don't realize until you have to teach a bunch of students going through their radiology rotation for the first time is the flipping of the image. So one of the hardest things for me to do is when we're talking about a piece of art with students in a radiology unit is figure out what they're talking about because they mix up their lefts and their rights the whole time. So I really have to be on my toes. But that's great work that you do. Yeah.
Thank you, this was great. And I previously worked at Penn Medicine and saw some of this work brought to life in another way through this, something called narrative medicine.
Yes.
Which is, I hadn't known what that is, but essentially it's the idea of bringing storytelling, whatever that may be, to medicine and communication in particular. And the way I saw it was primarily in people who were writing about medicine. For example, there was someone who came in from Bellevue, and she runs a creative writing journal there that's existed for a few decades. So I'm just curious if you've found yourself intersecting in that world as well, although of course this is a type of narrative medicine, just visually focused.
Agreed. One of the things that I found though is that they're often used differently in medicine right now. Narrative medicine is often very focused on building empathy from the physician towards the patient and sort of trying to narrate out the experience that they're having to build that out. And a lot of work in the visual arts has been focused around emotional intelligence and building empathy certainly, but also just deeply, at least in the work that I do, around unconscious bias in decision making. So we have sometimes different outcomes, but this should come as no surprise to you. There is a little community of us in this town that are deeply interested in the intersection between the humanities and medicine. There is a medical humanities network of like geeky old people like me that get together and just talk, brainstorm, collaborate, whatever that thing may be, and they're from all of the area healthcare systems. Everybody has one, and Penn has a great program. So does Temple. So does Cooper over at Maryland University, and all of their directors are in our little coffee patch.
Well, thank you, this was great, really.
Thanks for coming. You're all trying to decide if it's a real ear or not, aren't you?
If there's no more questions, I'm going to bring off the virtual audience. So we have a couple of folks who are asking similar questions, but also someone asked pretty early in the lecture about whether or not women could attend dissections in Amsterdam. I think you were referring to the program in the beginning.
Oh, so the question was, could women attend the dissections at the Amsterdam Surgeons Guild?
Yeah, if there's any other way that women were involved that wasn't so obvious, or they weren't maybe added to it.
So it's interesting. I don't officially know the answer to that question, but I'm going to take a wild, stinking guess that the answer is no. I feel confident in that particular bet. The other thing about that, though, that I will say, and one of the reasons why, even if they were present, they would never have appeared in that painting. Little known fact about a piece like that, all of those other dudes that weren't Dr. Tulp, they were paid money to be in that portrait. That would have been part of their own professional brand. So considering the lack of access to education, the fact that we were rarely allowed to own property or control our own finances, I don't think we would have been allowed in the room or to buy our way into that painting. That's my best guess. I'm going to look it up after this because now I want to know for sure.
So someone else is asking if you can repeat the names of the two artists at the end of the lecture who worked in photography projects.
Two artists.
The motion.
Oh, motion study photography?
The Paul Walker and
Sure. So the Philadelphian is Thomas Eakins. E-A-K-I-N-S. That was in Philadelphia, and the collaborator is Edward Muybridge, E-A-D-W-E-A-R-D, I think, Muybridge, M-U-Y-B-R-I-D-G-E. Also worth noting, both kind of bad dudes, so celebrate the photography, but also investigate the legacy, because they both have really complicated legacies of how they did the work that I did not have time, I will never have time to fully unpack and talk about such a broad subject. But just, I just want to put that asterisk next to them so that we don't lionize them too much.
So I'll ask one more from the virtual audience. Is there a favorite piece of art of yours that really fits this topic that maybe you weren't able to cover tonight?
Ooh, that's interesting. There are a lot of pieces of art that speak to this topic that I can talk about tonight. One I threw up at the very end but didn't talk about is George Tucker's painting Ward, which was that very sterile-looking environment of a hospital scene. I really like the way Tucker investigates sort of the coldness of modern systems. I like that piece. I really like Frida Kahlo's self-portrait of what medicine and health feels like in a broken body. I think it's really moving. I like Alice Neal's portrait of what it looked like to be suffering from, I think, tuberculosis in some of the communities in New York that she was celebrating, and really sort of humanizing what that looks like. Those are just a couple of them, but there's also many, I mean, if you like the dissection ones, there are many paintings by other artists of anatomy lessons. There are many portraits of health and wellness. It goes a lot in different ways, but obviously I picked a lot of my favorites to show you tonight. That's how this goes, right? That's fun. But is that our last question?
Yeah, I think so. I think we've covered everything else.
That's awesome. So thank you. You stayed so long. You hung out with me for a while. I really appreciate it.